Good afternoon, and I want to thank you all for taking the time to join me today. Serving you in the United States Senate is an incredible honor, and I need to hear from you about the challenges you're seeing out on the ground and what we can do better in Washington, D.C. Uh, look, uh, my in-person town halls are much more difficult now, unfortunately, because of this pandemic. But we continue to meet with people, community leaders, rank and file folks, business owners, anybody we can when we're back in the state to get their input. And these virtual Q&As have allowed me to continue to answer questions directly from Montanans and get input on what you really want to see happening here in Washington, D.C. It is part of my job as your senior senator, and I would hope that everybody in the delegation would consider doing these with regularity. I'm talking to you today on the heels of something that doesn't happen very often in Washington, D.C., and that's the passage of a bipartisan piece of legislation that will have tangible impacts on our state's economy and, by the way, the economy of the whole nation. This law, which I spent the better part of this year negotiating and writing with a group of 5 Republicans and 4 other Democrats, will rebuild our state's infrastructure. In that process, it will create and maintain good paying jobs and lower costs for Montana's families and grow our economy and give a basis for that growth in the economy to continue for generations. As I travel across our state, I see roads that need to be fixed. I see bridges that need to be brought up to standards. I see water systems that are outdated and wore out. And I see a lack of high-speed internet holding our communities and our economy back. And Washington has talked about infrastructure for decades, but quite frankly has never got much done on that issue. And it is the basis for our economy, and we do need to invest in it, and it finally happened. We finally got her done, and in this bill, which we call the Bipartisan Infrastructure Package, and it goes by some other names too. But what's in this bill is billions of dollars for Montana's roads, bridges, highways, airports, hundreds of millions of dollars for rural water projects to make sure that communities have water, to make sure that farmers, ranchers have water, to be able to survive as communities and grow food as farmers and ranchers. There is significant resources in this bill to expand high-speed internet to every corner of our state, which will allow Montanans to work and access telehealth and distance learn from anywhere in the state. This is a big deal in the 21st century. I think getting broadband out to every house is critically important if our economy is going to be all it can be. And then there's also billions in resources to improve security at our borders and more to mitigate wildlife and flood risk. And this, by the way, will all be built with iron and steel and construction materials that are made in the USA. So this is a win-win deal. It's a win-win deal for working families. It's a win-win deal for our business community. It's a win-win deal for everybody in the state. And like I said, the same applies to our nation as a whole. These are urgently needed investments, many of which have gone on for literally decades without proper rebuilding. And in the process of rebuilding and building new infrastructure, it's going to create jobs. I think it's going to have a depressing effect on inflation, which is good, and that will be help with costs for families and for businesses. It's going to also work to maintain our economic advantage over China and ensure that America will remain the premier economy. And this is done without raising any taxes on Montana families. I'm going to talk probably more about this bill as we get into the Q&A on this and any other topic, but let's just jump right straight to the questions. The first question is from Madison B. And it deals with the infrastructure bill. It says, thanks for getting the infrastructure bill passed. Any thoughts on when or where rural Montana might start benefiting from access to better internet or internet at all? My parents sure would like to have a little fiber at their place in Powell County. Look, I think broadband is going to be coming to your parents' place in Powell County, and this investment in high-speed internet is going to serve every corner of our state, east, west, north, and south. So what needs to happen first is the FCC needs to put forth their broadband maps, which will determine which areas are underserved and unserved in terms of internet service. These areas probably are going to include quite a bit of Montana. I know I'm on the edge on all this stuff where I live. But there will be additional resources to close the gap in high-speed internet access. Now, I will tell you this, these FCC maps are expected to be finalized early this next year. And then I think the grant money from the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, which is part of the Department of Commerce, will begin rolling out in Montana. I'm hoping, if we push these people, and we're going to be pushing them hard, I'm hoping it'll be starting in hopefully mid-spring, maybe even early spring if we get really lucky. Montana's going to get well over $100 million for high-speed internet in this bill. I'm communicating with stakeholders every day, pushing hard to get that money out the door as quickly as possible and as responsibly as possible. And we have some challenges. We're going to need skilled workers to build this infrastructure. I actually have a bill called the Telecommunications Skilled Workforce Development Act, and it was included in this package to be able to ramp up hiring and training necessary to meet the infrastructure construction needs efficiently and effectively of broadband infrastructure. So, look, we got the bill passed 2-3 weeks ago. I think the president signed it. We look forward to those maps coming out, and then we look forward to having some dirt moved and some fiber put in the ground so that Montana, the whole of Montana, can join the 21st century. I think it's going to be really important. I compare it to be very similar to electrification in the 40s. Where if you didn't have electricity, you were put at a tremendous economic disadvantage. I think it's the same thing with broadband. And as soon as we get this broadband in, I think we're going to see opportunities for business and employment that we've never seen before, quite honestly. It'll be a different way of doing business, but I think it'll be very, very healthy for our economy. Then we've got Grant B has the question, where are we at with funding for wildfire fighting? Is the United States Forest Service still spending half their budget annually on firefighting? And is there a more reasonable source like FEMA? Okay, so this is a huge issue. It's been a huge issue in Montana for 15 or 20 years. We just witnessed some more fires last week in December. We saw what happened in Denton, Montana, down in Gibson Flats, up in Browning, where we have fires in the wintertime that are stoked by 50, 60, 70 mile an hour winds. And, it takes a pretty good cut out of small communities and big communities alike. And quite frankly, in those efforts, we're doing everything we can do to help support those communities, and we'll continue to do that. But getting to your point about Forest Service wildfire fighting, which is what we normally think of when we think of wildfires, not the kind of grass fires and range fires that happened last week in Montana. Back in 2018 appropriations bill, we allowed the Forest Service access to additional funding without having to borrow from other accounts. That means they didn't have to spend their money used for forest management to fight fires. And that was always a big problem because there was too much of their budget that was left for fighting fire, that was used for fighting fires, and little was left for management. But the truth is, because of climate change, we're seeing fire costs continue to go up. And by the way, it's not just Montana. Everything west of the Mississippi, for the most part, experienced a drought this year. And the kind of money that went in to fighting fires all across the West was huge. And so we've got to continue to try to attack it from a climate change standpoint too. I'm talking about the fire seasons that we have in Montana. It's also important to note that the bipartisan infrastructure package includes about $3.33 billion for reducing wildfire risk called mitigation. I have already called on the Forest Service to put that work on projects like, and this is a premier project for how this money could be used, cleaning up the watershed that Butte has for their drinking water. It's a very important project, and quite frankly, it's why this money was put in there. So hopefully they can get after that and get that done to secure Butte's source of drinking water. But there's other things they can do too in areas of mitigation. This infrastructure bill also puts billions of dollars into modernizing our electrical grid. It deploys carbon capture and clean hydrogen technologies, and it supports renewable energy projects. So this bill does step up in a big way on climate change, but there's more to do there too. And I also think that, as you've pointed out in your question, funding the Forest Service and the Department of Interior is critically important, especially when it comes to mitigation, to be able to prevent these fires before they start. By the way, it's also good to note that fire is a natural part of the landscape and will continue to happen. We just got to do a better job of controlling it so it doesn't get out of control and take properties like we saw earlier, about a week ago. Then we've got Ann A., who asks, Senator, how do you intend to vote on the President's Build Back Better bill? That's a mouthful. Look, this bill came over from the House. It is still being negotiated. I am still working to ensure that the final bill contains some of my priorities to really cut costs for Montana families and cut taxes along the way. It's got to make sense for rural America. It's got to make sense for Montana. But here's some things that this bill does that I think are very beneficial. Lowering the cost of prescription drugs, critically important. The number of folks out there that are dependent upon prescription drugs is very high, and we need to make sure that we're able to lower those costs, and I'll tell you how here in a minute. Housing. There just simply isn't any housing in Montana. I don't care if it's a big city or a small town. Housing is a premium. It's one of the things that makes those fires that burnt those houses up kind of double whammy, because there's not a lot of housing for people to move into. And then the cost of childcare is keeping people out of the workforce. If the pandemic taught folks anything, it's the fact that they could stay home and take care of their kids. They didn't have to work, and they probably made more money because they didn't have those childcare costs. So this Build Back Better bill is going to, address those issues. And I will tell you, negotiation of prescription drugs, critically important, and we need to do that. The VA has been doing it for years. Medicare needs to do it. The housing issue, been able to have federal dollars leveraging private dollars to make more affordable workforce housing, will allow communities to grow. And childcare, as I've already pointed out, has become so expensive that people can, it's just eating up all of a paycheck, or maybe even more in some cases. But also, let me tell you what's not in this legislation, because there's a lot of folks running around the state making claims when they haven't really paid much attention to what's in this legislation. Number one, there's no provision in the bill to send a massive payout to people who cross the border illegally. That's number one. Number two, there's no one making under $400,000 is going to see a tax increase. Millionaires and huge corporations will be required to pay their fair share in taxes, while working families are going to get a tax cut. And there are also several misguided tax provisions, which I successfully killed to date, that would have created burdensome IRS red tape and hurt Montana's family farms, ranches, and Main Street businesses, like the change to the so-called stepped-up basis. So, look, I'm going to end where I started, and that is the bill still being negotiated. I anticipate there's a fair chance we could get to it before Christmas, but we still have some work to do to get this bill ready for prime time. Thanks for the question, Ann. Then we've got Val K. That asks, oh boy, I kind of answered this question earlier, but what, if anything, can be done to stop escalating costs of prescription medication? Look, there's too many Montanans, too many Americans that are facing rising prescription drug costs, and solving this is very important to me. And we've got more work to do. I think it is a top priority for me as I talk about negotiating the Build Back Better bill. But here's some things we can do. We can allow Medicare to negotiate prices of prescription drugs. I think that's fair. I think that's how capitalism should work. We could create penalties for companies that increase the cost of drugs faster than inflation. We could cap Medicare Part D out-of-pocket costs at $2,000 and eliminate coverage gap. And we could also cap insulin prices at $35 a month. Look, I think that the pharmaceutical companies do a great job developing pharmaceuticals that work. Oftentimes these drugs are, the research part, if not all, is paid for by National Institute of Health, taxpayer dollars. We need to get the benefits of that. We, being the taxpayers, need to get the benefits of that. And I want them to stay in business. I want to encourage them to continue to manufacture new, better, improved drugs. But the bottom line is these have to be affordable. If they're not affordable and people can't use them, they really they don't get to the problem to solve the problem. So we're working hard to make sure that happens. I think it's something that if we do this right, everybody can win. Consumer can win. The folks who develop the drugs can win, and we can all be treated fairly. Christopher C. asks, how can we apply pressure to municipalities to loosen their land use regulations and allow development of housings that we desperately need, and we do desperately need housing. We're seeing costs rise pretty rapidly. There's not a lot of supply out there. I can tell you there's a lot of communities, and I mean a lot of communities, that businesses can't grow, startups can't happen because there's no place for employees to live. And so bringing down the cost of housing is another key that I'm fighting hard to address in the Build Back Better bill. And quite frankly, if we do this right, it can help both rural and urban areas, small towns and cities, towns in Montana and out. But there needs to be competitive grants to help communities improve and implement housing plans and strategies, and that includes looking at zoning and land use regulation. But the bottom line is we have to get more supply onto the marketplace. And I am open to any suggestions any of you might have, and of course the time is of the essence here as we negotiate this, but I think that if we can get more supply, we can see businesses expand, we can see startups happen, we can see communities grow, we can see our economy grow. So thank you for that question, Christopher C. Staying in the C lane, we've got Patricia C., who asks, what is being done to address the rampant voter suppression legislation and gerrymandering? And Patricia, you were so spot on. Look, the United States has always been a beacon of liberty, and free and fair elections are a cornerstone of the democracy. Montana, I can tell you, has some of the safest elections in the country. Unfortunately, the legislature didn't see it that way. And so they enacted a bunch of things, a bunch of legislation that would actually prevent a lot of folks or make it much more difficult for a lot of folks to vote. That, in fact, is very, very unfortunate because being able to vote is how our voices are heard, and everybody should have equal access to the ballot box. We crafted a bill, and I was proud to work with a number of my colleagues to craft this bill called the Freedom to Vote Act. And quite honestly, this bill is a good bill that allows for a lot of the things that have been allowed in the past, for like voter IDs. And quite honestly, it's the right thing to do because it allows people to vote who want to vote. And it also, by the way, as a sidebar, people talk about how much money's in these elections, and I agree with you, there's far too much in it. This kicks the dark money out of our elections. So those folks that are trying to influence our elections from out of state, they aren't going to be able to do that. Those folks that have no role, they put up ads. We don't know who they are. We don't know what their agenda is. Those dollars will be out. But the bottom line is this, and this is the way it was when I first got in the legislature. Folks work to make it easier to vote on both sides of the aisle, not harder. Make it easier. And quite frankly, that's what we should go back to today. And if we're going to have a democracy that works, everybody ought to have a right to get to the ballot box. People shouldn't be dissuaded. There shouldn't be roadblocks put up to keep them from having their voices heard at the ballot box. So thank you for that question. Lee B., what can we do to help pass Blackfoot Clearwater Stewardship Act? Look, thanks for the question, Lee. This is a great policy that comes from the ground up. It's a true made in Montana solution. The results in decades worth of collaboration. I said decades, plural, worth of collaboration between ranchers, timber, recreation, conservation, wildlife groups, conservation. And quite honestly, this is a bill that was crafted before I got in the United States Senate. And then folks came in and asked me if I would carry it. And it's a good bill. And it does some really good things for the Sealy area, for the Blackfoot River watershed. And this bill was just heard in the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee last October. And we're continuing to push till we get this common sense legislation across the finish line. And if you want to know what you can do, put pressure on the folks I serve with from Montana back here in Washington, D.C. For whatever reason, and I can't guess why, because this thing polls at over 70% popularity. The Blackfoot Clearwater Stewardship Act polls at over 70%. But for some reason, the rest of the folks in the delegation would just as soon not support it and support it. It's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do for Montana. Certainly the right thing to do for the Blackfoot, which is one of the truly marvelous rivers that we have in the state of Montana. Mary M. asks, please give me an update on the status of the comprehensive and overdue Support for Troops of War Act of 2021. That's a mouthful. We call it the Cost of War Act. And what this bill would do would allow veterans of all generations affected by toxic exposure. This would include the 3.5 million that served in Iraq and Afghanistan to obtain immediate and lifelong access to VA health care. And you might say, why? Why? Well, there's a little thing called burn pits and oil well fires that, the folks that served in Iraq and Afghanistan were exposed. And we need to make sure we're doing right by those folks. By the way, this isn't the first time we've had toxic exposure either. You might remember Agent Orange from the Vietnam War. You might remember radiation exposure from World War II. You might remember mustard gas from World War I. Look, there's been toxic exposures from nearly every conflict that's been out there, and that's what this bill is to address. Prior to Memorial Day, this bill came out of committee, and I think this sent an important message to Congress and the VA that we want to get this done. And we're in process and have been negotiating with the VA. I think this bill has momentum to move forward. We're going to continue to work in a bipartisan way and with the White House and the VA and veterans advocate groups to figure out a path forward. This is the right thing to do. And as the folks that are opposed to this don't like this bill because it's going to cost money, and what I would tell them is you're right, and I think that's unfortunate. But if you don't want to take care of our veterans when they come home from war, you shouldn't have sent them in the first place. And toxic exposure is real. We have heard testimony from veterans who have had lung dysfunction because of these burn pits that have created some real problems with these guys getting enough air and gals getting enough air to be able to survive. And then we need to also continue to do research on this because there may be other issues that were created by these burn pits that have affected our veterans. Martin L. says, I would like to hear your thoughts on the military spending bill coming up. Is it too expensive? Is it too lean? Does it need amendments? Do you plan to vote for it? I do plan to vote for it. I think that the top line number isn't as important as how it's spent. I think this money is spent responsibly. We are in a situation where China is the pacing threat for us. Russia's still out there knocking around, and so is North Korea and Iran. And China is front and foremost. I think we've seen this by some of the actions of the administration just this week. And this bill, I think, meets the needs of our military. We need to get it passed, though. It should have been passed in end of September, by the end of September, but we need to get it passed in order to counter adversaries like China, like Russia, and make sure that our troops have the equipment and the training they need to tackle the 21st century threats. And so this is a good bill, and I intend to support it. Thanks for the question, Martin. Barbara G. asked, what can you best do to help eastern Montana farmers and ranchers as they tackle the drought? And man, did we have a bad drought. This was Charlotte on my 44th harvest, and it was the worst harvest ever, not by a little bit, but by a lot. There are safety net programs out there that the USDA has, and we are working to modify some of those safety net programs to get the money to the agricultural producers earlier. You know, there's a lot of cow-calf guys that, especially the younger ranchers, that aren't going to be able to make it if we don't get them some help. That impacts our food chain, that impacts our economy in Montana. And so what I would recommend, if you're in the business of agriculture, and if you were probably affected by this drought. There were only a few slivers that weren't in the state of Montana, and quite frankly, west of the Mississippi as far as that's concerned. But go to the FSA office. There's a livestock forage disaster program. There's emergency assistance for livestock program. There's emergency haying. There's some other NAP programs out there, the non-insured crop disaster assistance program. There's a number of programs out there. Sit down with your FSA person that you have in the office. They know these programs like the back of their hand, literally, and they can help you through what's out there. And then Hoven, Senator Hoven out of North Dakota, myself, are working on getting some money available sooner rather than later, and hopefully we can get that done in the next 10 days or so to get quicker forage assistance out there for livestock producers. I would just close on this question because agriculture is the #1 industry in Montana. If you're having trouble getting assistance, don't be afraid to give Jesse in my Helena office a call. He's a good guy and he knows the business and he'll help you out. Michael W. says, it appears as if the current administration is hostile to the oil and gas industry. What can you do to ensure those in the industry that we won't be losing our jobs? Look, Montana oil and gas, essential part of our economy. I always tell folks that, you know, every morning before I got in the field, I dump about 150 gallons of diesel fuel on my tractor. I need that, otherwise I can't farm. And so it's important to note, though, that the administration has not slowed down energy production. Domestic energy production in the United States is still going strong. Natural gas output is rising. Oil production is hitting record levels in the country. And the administration did announce a pause on oil and gas leasing. By the way, I called on them to make sure that it didn't impact any workers out in the oil patch. But the reason they did that was to make sure that the taxpayer was getting a fair shake on the amount of royalties that's being paid. There was a study that was done. The study came back right around Thanksgiving, and it showed that, you know, we need to take a look. If we're going to be competitive with the private sector with royalty costs, we need to bump this up some. And for the folks that think that that's going to cut off production, look, Texas increased their royalty rates quite dramatically on their state lands, and it didn't have any impact on their energy production. I think this is about making sure the taxpayer gets a fair shake and gets a fair return on their investment. And so let's take a look at that. Let's be fair. Let everybody continue to go. Like I said, we are still very dependent upon oil and gas to help move our economy along. Hopefully that changes over time, to be honest with you, but that's also going to create jobs as it does, as moves forward. Um, Paul B., will you put a price on carbon to drive a fair transition to clean energy? What other ways do you support addressing the effects and cause on Montana's climate change? So here's the deal, Paul. There's been a lot of carbon tax proposals here, and I'll just be flat honest with you, I haven't found one that works yet. And I don't say that as somebody who doesn't believe in climate change. I absolutely believe in climate change. We had one of the worst years. We had the worst year I've ever had on the farm. And I will tell you that the impact of climate change is real, and we're seeing stuff like the town of Denton lose 28 houses in the middle of December. That didn't used to happen, I'm telling you. There's stuff going on in our climate. I personally think that if you take a look at what we did in the bipartisan infrastructure package with modernizing the electrical grid, investing in electric vehicle infrastructure, funding renewable energy demonstration projects, testing large-scale carbon capture projects, making a significant investment, in fact, the largest investment in history in public transit. That's a great first step, but we have to do more. And I think we're going to continue to look for opportunities to do more. I will tell you that I also believe that unleashing the mind and research and development is something that can make a big difference. If you take a look at battery technology, for example, it needs to be brought down in cost, and it needs to be better across the board. And I think how you do that is with some investments in R&D. The same could be said for nuclear waste, investing in R&D to figure out how we can make that benign. The same could be said for carbon capture. Let's figure out ways to make it happen with more efficiency and better cost return. And then the same thing can be said not only for battery technology, for new generation methods that are out there. Fusion is something that's always been about 20 years off, but there's a company in Washington State that is on the cusp of commercialization of fusion. That would be a game changer. And so that's where we're at on energy. Appreciate the question. Lauren H., why is DeJoy still ruining the Postal Service? Great question. I agree. I wished he would have been gone a long time ago. He is the Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy, by the way, for those that don't know him. We've seen the Postal Service decline in service under his watch. I think it was intentionally done. I don't know why, but it was. There is a fellow by the name of Ron Bloom that has stepped down as chairman of the USPS Board of Governors. That is good because it's my hope that the person to replace him would move on from DeJoy and get the Postal Service back on track. Terry M. asks, what is the chance of passing your country of origin labeling bill? Is the rest of the delegation on board? Look, I think mandatory country of origin labeling has become a bipartisan thing, and I like that a lot. That's not always the way it has been, but it is now, and I'll celebrate that. I think, as I've said before, America makes the best beef in the world, and we ought to be labeling it as such. We shouldn't be bringing in beef from Brazil or anywhere else to mix with our beef and then putting a USDA stamp on it so the consumer thinks it's all USA meat. Let's get a product of USA logo on this stuff so the consumer knows what they're buying. I think it'll help the consumer. I think it'll help the cow-calf operator. I think it'll help the small and medium-sized feeders. And then we can market the best food in the world. I think it's going to pass. I don't think it's going to be done before the first of the year. But, you know, we've got Senator Thune from South Dakota, Senator Rounds from South Dakota, got Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey, myself, and there's others that are about this. This is a little different in the Blackfoot bill. I think that hopefully the rest of the delegation will get on the bill. I welcome their support, and I welcome an upcoming piece of legislation in the House. This is important. If we're going to have our food chain work as we all want it to work, you know, those cow-calf producers, they're important. And if those guys go down, we got a problem. And by the way, The Packers are making bank on their backs right now, and we need to start looking out for those guys. They do a good job, and they need to get paid for the work they do in the form of good calf prices. Next, we have Roylene B. Roylene works on bringing telemedicine to Indian country and has a question about making this happen as quickly and as efficiently as possible, since access to healthcare on the reservations is a priority. It is a priority. It's also needs improvement. And one of the opportunities out there is in telehealth. We delivered money in the CARES Act, which was passed last year, that was funding to expand telehealth in Indian country and other rural areas of Montana. But we've got more work to do. And by the way, the bipartisan legislation that I've talked about time and time again on this call has about $2 billion for tribal broadband connectivity, which is going to help with telehealth. And so we need to work on some workforce development. But in the end, I think this is going to bode out well for Indian country. I'm gonna wrap it up there, and just let you know that I wasn't able to get to every question, but we will answer every question in writing. We'll get back to you, and you can also submit additional questions at tester.senate.gov/contact. That's tester.senate.gov/contact. I want to thank you all for joining us. I hope our paths cross soon. I encourage everybody to get vaccinated. It is really important. We've got the new Omicron virus that looks to be very, very transmittable. And so we want you all to be safe and healthy during the holidays. So get out there and get vaccinated. And in the meantime, be safe and be well. Have a great holiday season, everybody. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.